you everyone for being here today. I'm very excited to moderate this panel on stories from the field. And I also want to echo what Kelly said about what an incredible pleasure it has been to work with her in planning today. I really couldn't ask for anything more in a collaborator. But moving on to this panel, today we have two very exciting guests with us. We have first Adam Lowenstein, who is joining us from SUMA Education, and I'm going to let them really tell you a lot more about themselves in their introductions, both the work they do and how they ended up beginning there. But he is the Vice President of Counsel and Enrollment with SUMA Education, and then we also have Natalie Purcell with us, who is doing some fantastic work at the Veterans. I'm sorry, I actually forgot my book here, but she's doing some fantastic work as well at the San Francisco Medical Center, working with the VA. And she did her work in sociology at UC Santa Cruz. So as we get started, I'll first tell you a little bit more about what's driven me in being up here today. What I do right now, I'm at as Kelly said, I'm the Associate Director at the Center for the Humanities at UC SanDiego. And the work I do there is a lot around similar sort of research management, research programming. I run fellowships. I help organize research working groups. What is most interesting about it to me is the ability to be an intellectual matchmaker, the ability to find people working in different sites around the academy and outside of the academy, and find places to bring them together. Find ways to make new conversations happen. I'm very passionate about the knowledge and value of the humanities. I think that we bring something incredibly important, not only to the academy, but also to the world around us. And this is a position I found that really enables me to capitalize on that passion. It's not just about doing my research. I've continued to do my research, even as I think like many recently graduated PhDs struggling sometimes to find places to fit it into a busy schedule. But beyond that, this position enables me to work with other people's research much more intimately and much more engaged than a traditional tenure track would enable. So this, the work in this room is another way of doing that, because what we're doing to me and what the panelists I hope can speak to is the ways that the intellectual work that they do as humanists reaches out and makes other unexpected connections. So with that, I'll let our panelists tell you a little bit about what they do, and I'll ask you to say, what your current job is and what you do maybe on a daily basis and how you got there.
Okay, I'll start. Everybody can hear me okay? It's not too loud, is it? I feel like it's feedbacky. All right. I'm Adam Lowenstein. I'm Vice President of Counseling and Enrollment at an education startup called SUMA Education here in San Diego. I'll just tell you a little bit about the job and what I do on a day-to-day basis and how I got there. What my role mainly is working with young people, mainly high school students, but also starting with some middle school students, to plan for college, essentially, largely speaking. With my humanities background, I'm actually very gratified to be able to speak with some really, really bright students who are going to end up going to the UCs and into the Ivies and Ivy level colleges, and explain to them from a humanist's perspective why the humanities is important. This is not my job description exactly, but this is what I sort of secretly slip into the conversations that I have with a largely sort of STEM-oriented student body, and the parents in particular are the ones who I'm convincing. And on a day-to-day basis, I open young people's and some older people's eyes to the value of the humanities. For instance, a lot of my students want to go on to medical school, and I have to explain first that there's no such thing as a medicine major, which is a shock to them. Second, I explain that you don't have to major in biology or even in a STEM subject to get to medical school. And in fact, majoring in humanities often puts you in a better position to get into medical school, and they're just blown away by that. I list the top 3 majors for med students, philosophy, history, and English, and they're like, you're lying. I'm like, no, American Medical Association statistics. In any case, it's really more of a per capita kind of thing. More humanities majors who apply to med school get in than STEM majors get in, but I don't explain that part to them. It's too much detail. But the fact is, what I end up explaining to them is if you want to go into a field like medicine or even in engineering, the value of a humanities education is that it teaches you to solve problems from a lot of different perspectives. It teaches you to be a creative problem solver, much more than an engineering degree might. I talk about Harvey Mudd College sometimes because this is an engineering school that deeply values the humanities. And I ask them, why do you think that's true? And they don't really know why. And I get to explain it. That's a tiny little slice of what I do. The company is also, we're also a test prep company, and that kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth to say, but that tells you what the values of the company are, that those of us who founded the company, it's only about 3 years old, came from humanities graduate programs, essentially. A lot of us have graduate degrees in the humanities. Some of us have PhDs, others masters, others are just really talented teachers. And we all value teaching above all else. We value teaching skills and concepts above all else, teaching actual ideas. And for all of the disparaging statements that you hear about test prep, and most of them are true, the fact is tests like the SAT and the ACT are opportunities for talented teachers and for a company like ours to be able to have a captive audience of young people who are there really to get a score, but then to turn the tables on them and actually teach them how to reason effectively, how to synthesize ideas and communicate them articulately, how to appreciate really good texts and writing, and how to strengthen their vocabularies and to be strong communicators. And they're sort of surprised at the end of that when they realize, oh, that actually helped me get a really good score. And that's another thing I get to convince people of on a daily basis, is that actually teaching skills, actually being a teacher of something valuable in the context of something that isn't so valuable, which is a standardized test, is actually a way of doing well on those tests, but also having skills that will be valuable after the test is over. I like to tell them, I like to ask them, what value do you think your SAT score is going to have after the day of the test? And they're like, I don't know, get me into college. I'm like, yeah. When you get a job, is anybody going to ask for your, has anybody had anybody ask them for their SAT score applying for a job? No. I think consulting firms like McKinsey and maybe investment banks sometimes do because they want prestige, but that's it. I'm like, I want you to come away from the process, from whatever class you take, and be a more intelligent person and actually have valuable skills. I want you to be a better student. We think of ourselves as not teaching subjects, but teaching students, and that's the whole attitude of the company. So I came to the company right after it started because this was how the company was framed for me by a friend of mine who was also in the UCLA English PhD program before I was, and who I knew actually at another company, which was a more typical test prep company where I worked to basically buy groceries and actually make a living wage while a grad student, making the $1,800 a month. That wasn't really sufficient to live. He opened the company about 3 years ago and recruited me to come work for him. And I've helped it grow now for the last 3 years, so that we have 2 offices in San Diego now, and we're hoping to grow outside of San Diego in the next few years as well. My background, I'll just be brief because I think I've said a lot already. I have a PhD in English from UCLA. Like Kelly, I got it in 2011, and for the couple of years before that, while I was on the job market, I was also looking around for alternatives. As the alt-ac conversations really got started around 2009 and 10, at least within my sphere, I became very, very interested and very, very compelled by them and very drawn into them, especially as the adjunct movement and contingent labor conversations were really amping up. And I went on the job market. I failed on the job market. I had the same kinds of experiences that you'll probably hear a lot of people have. I had interviews and I didn't get the jobs. I didn't have any campus interviews or anything like that. And I was only half-hearted the whole time because I unlike Kelly, who I think, I don't want to say that she doesn't want to teach, but it sounded like the research side of things was more her interest. For me, teaching was always the interest. I have a background in music as well, and the idea of teaching and being in front of people and performing and getting to kind of engage people in something I'm passionate about was really what I wanted to be doing. So teaching at an R1 institution was never top of my list, and the liberal arts college jobs are just as scarce. So I looked for other things, and it turned out that having friends who I had worked with in graduate school but also worked with on those sort of side jobs is what ultimately gave me a conduit to these alternatives. And I guess if I had one takeaway to give you, it would be keep in touch with people who you know in whatever sphere that you circulate in, and keep reaching out to them and keep the conversations going. And believe me, it's a very supportive group of people that you work with, believe it or not, and they want to help you too. And I think that's why all of us are here too, because we're also available for that. Is that everything? Yeah. Okay, I'll pass the mic now. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Natalie Purcell, and I just want to say that it's such a pleasure to be here today. I'm really grateful to be here, not so much to tell my story, but to hear what your questions are and to hear what your stories are, to interact with so many grad students doing fascinating work in so many different disciplines last night at dinner was really rewarding for me. And I was struck by, in the logo for Humanists at Work, it says still searching, and I think that that those of us sitting up here are very much in that mode as well. I think I've got feedback. Give me a moment. Sorry. And I don't think that that really ends, so I really look forward to this conversation. To give you just briefly a little bit about my background, I'm a sociologist. I am educated at UC Santa Cruz. I graduated in 2011, and my work really, I was a sociologist, but my work really bridged the social sciences and the humanities. I focused on media studies and cultural studies in the area of violence, intervention, and prevention. Maybe I can just speak louder. Sorry for the feedback, I apologize. So after graduating from UC Santa Cruz in 2011, I spent 2 years as a presidential management fellow at the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I worked at the San Francisco VA healthcare system, which is a large integrated healthcare system that includes several community-based outpatient clinics across 7 counties in Northern California, as well as our main campus and hospital in San Francisco. And the San Francisco VA is affiliated with UCSF Medical School. It has the largest research program in the country for any VA. And we serve over 40,000 patients, 40,000 veterans every year. Many of those veterans are living in poverty. We have large social work and mental health programs that address homelessness, drug addiction, mental illness. And recently, the San Francisco VA, this is about 2 years ago now, the San Francisco VA, like many VAs across the country, decided that they wanted to establish an Office of Patient-Centered Care. And I was appointed coming out of my fellowship to direct the new Office of Patient-Centered Care and to create it. And I'm just kind of curious, has anybody heard this phrase, patient-centered care? Okay, wow, that's exciting. Yeah, well, patient-centered care is really an international movement that is dedicated to transforming healthcare systems to better reflect the values and priorities of the patients that they serve. And that means really tailoring the care to the individual. And patient-centered care is also about ensuring that the values and voices of patients play a defining role in shaping how business gets done in healthcare, that they're really shaping the programs and policies of the healthcare system. And it's about changing the nature and really changing the implicit power dynamics of the clinician-patient relationship to enlist patients as truly engaged and truly motivated partners in planning their own care. So in a nutshell, it's really about listening better and about doing things differently based on what we hear. And this is really relatively new territory for the Veterans Administration. And I think it's worth noting that it was totally new territory for me when I started at VA as a fellow. And I certainly didn't know that that was the direction that I was going to be going in. The work that I do at VA is very different from the work that I thought I was going to be doing when I went to grad school and when I was on the job market. And so I hope to have the opportunity today to talk to you all a little bit more about how that transition took place, and also about the really unexpected and kind of weird ways that I ended up using my education and my skill set as a sociologist to work at the VA.
Good, thank you. I wonder, could you speak a little bit more about that transition and specifically also about the Presidential Management Fellowship? I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with that program.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. And I just want to ask, can everyone hear me? Because I know there were issues with the microphone. Okay, good, I'm glad. So the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, let me start there. The PMF program is the federal government's program designed to recruit people who are completing graduate degrees in any discipline, really any discipline, to recruit them into federal service by doing a 2-year fellowship where you have accelerated promotion potential and built-in educational opportunities. And I was really excited about this PMF program. I learned about it early on in grad school, and I went to grad school knowing that I wanted to probably work in the public sector or in the nonprofit sector. I really wanted to do applied research if possible, but I was also interested in teaching and open to the traditional academic path, so I kind of had all the doors open. But the idea of the Presidential Management Fellowship Program really excited me as a route to try out federal service and to potentially do something really different with my PhD. So during my final year of grad school, I kind of put a lot of my eggs in that basket. I spent a lot of time, it was almost I think Kelly actually went through this, Kelly Brown went through the same application process, and it's almost an entire year that you spend going through different phases, and you find out as the months pass whether you made it to the next phase, and it involves taking written tests and then showing up for a whole day where you do interviews and speaking engagements, and then going to a job fair in Washington, D.C. where you do, I think in my case I did 12 interviews in 3 days with representatives from different federal agencies. So it's very intense, but typically coming out of that program, if you make it to the end, if you make it to the finalist stage, you can end up with a few different interesting job offers, and most of them are in Washington, D.C. But I was really, really happy when I had an offer from the San Francisco VA. And it's a weird environment, this job fair in Washington, D.C., because it's very fast and furious. And sometimes there isn't a huge amount of time or effort expended to really get to know the candidates. It's kind of your first impression is important, and also there's not a whole lot of time to get to know the agency or to get to know more information about the jobs that you're potentially going to say yes to in this span of 3 days. And in my case, there really was somewhat of a disconnect between what I thought I was signing up for and what I was signing up for at the Department of Veterans Affairs. The Health Services Research Department at the VA was the department that I was most interested in working in. As a sociologist who focused on social psychology of violence, and I studied violence and masculinity, and I really wanted to apply that work to be able to work with veterans in the U.S. military, especially those who had become enmeshed in the criminal justice system. The VA had a Veterans Justice Outreach program that I was really interested in working with, and I wanted to help understand the prevalence of domestic violence and sexual violence among vets and help the VA to develop programs to intervene and to prevent that problem. So I didn't really quite know how I would insert myself. So I didn't quite know how I was going to be able to do that work because my graduate studies were not super practical oriented. I wasn't doing like program evaluation research. I was not focusing in on doing studies on what worked and didn't work in terms of violence intervention. Again, I really worked in a cultural studies, media studies way, theorizing about the social psychology of violence and its links to gender. So I didn't have a sense of how the theoretical insights of my research could really inform the development of actual anti-violence programming. But I was excited at the prospect of being able to collaborate with clinical professionals who did have a little bit more practical experience, with epidemiologists, even with primary care physicians, to see what we could do together in response to that issue. So I was really excited to get to team up in applied research with this interdisciplinary group of people who are dedicated to this kind of work. So when I showed up on my very first day at the VA, I learned that this is not what I was going to be doing at all. So I reported to the office of my supervisor, and she said, I don't think we're going to assign you to work in the Health Services Research Department. She talked about how the medical center really had other priorities at that time, and that I was going to be assigned to do administrative work and accreditation review preparation work, starting in our pain clinic and in our sterile equipment processing department. So that was a big surprise. And it was also my first big wake-up call that I wasn't in an academic world anymore. And I realized over time that those initial assignments were really intentional. They were intended first and foremost, I think, to ensure that staff labor was directed toward the areas that were perceived as having the greatest unmet need in the medical center. And they were also there because the medical center had decided that they wanted to participate in the PMF program in order to get unique administrative managers, right? They wanted to find people who had very different backgrounds who could do administrative work, and they thought by putting us in these administrative roles, they could kind of test our mettle, see if we were capable of performing. So it's weird, within, I think, 6 months or within 8 months of starting at the VA, I was the acting administrative manager of 2 large community-based outpatient clinics. And I was doing work that was almost exclusively administrative in nature and couldn't have been further away from anything to do with violence or with my work as a sociologist, my research as a sociologist. But what was really interesting to me and what I can talk about if you'd like, is that I found that I was using my education and my skills and my background from my doctoral work in very unexpected ways, in ways that I hadn't foreseen at all, and that were not directly tied to what I studied and what I researched.
Good. I think I definitely want to come back to some of this, and I'm just going to ask 1 or 2 more questions. I have a lot more that I can continue with, but I think I'd really like to hear what people in the room's questions are as well, so kind of have that in your mind. One of the things I noticed in what both of you have said that I just want to bookmark too is both of you have kind of talked about something about a person-focused approach into the work you're doing, whether it's now in doing patient-centered care or in doing this sort of like different mode of teaching, even teaching test prep that is centered on the student, not on the subject. And so I think that's an interesting theme. You know, I just want to point out, and maybe we can come back to, But right now, I'd like to hear a little more from you, Adam, about more specifically, like about your decision to move away from a sort of like traditional career trajectory, and what advantages your current position has that perhaps you may not have in a traditional tenure track.
Sure. What motivated me to look outside of academia, I mean, I think it went all the way back to before I even went to graduate school. I remember riding on the blue bus at UCLA with my Shakespeare professor who took the bus every day, and he happened to be on the same bus as I was that afternoon. And it was right when I was ending my senior year as an undergrad there, and I ended up going there for graduate school too. And I told him I was thinking of going to graduate school in English, and he's like, "Why would you do that?" This is an older British man. I'm like, well, I'm passionate about literature. Shakespeare is amazing. He's like, and then he just went, I won't do the whole accent again, but he went into the story that probably some of you heard from your more blunt and honest advisors and professors as undergrads and even as graduate students about just the grim nature of academia. And this was 2002, so this is not even like what we think of as the peak of the crisis necessarily, but it's been this way for a while. And he basically put it thus. He said, if you get a job, which is not likely, you will make maybe $60,000 a year for a long time. And basically, he put it like I wouldn't be making very much money for a very long time, if at all. And there's so many other things aside from just the passion for literature that are involved. And I think he was laying it on extra thick just to make sure that the decision I made. He probably really didn't want me to apply to graduate school, actually, but I think he also wanted me to know that if I did, that keep other options open. That's what I took away from it. And I was super grateful to him for it. I didn't ask him to write me a letter of recommendation. Though I loved him, and he was definitely one of my most inspiring teachers. I decided to go to graduate school anyway because from everybody I talked to, the story was keep your options open. If you go to graduate school thinking that your only possible outcome is tenure track position at a R1 university or even at any four-year college or even at a two-year college for that matter, then you're setting yourself up for disaster. I mean, that was basically the story I had before I even applied. So I traveled to Thailand for a couple months to think about it. And while I was there, I was teaching English to some young Thai students, and I loved the teaching element. And like I said, I have a background in music, and just being in front of people and sparking their excitement about anything that I'm excited about is just my MO, no matter what I'm doing. And I realized while I was there, I'm like, okay, teaching one or two words of English to these young people is not enough for me. Like, I love what I'm doing here, but I want to go to graduate school. So I just decided. So I flew home like 3 days later, and I started applying, and I got into UCLA and went there because it's my home institution. And I had an amazing time in graduate school. I had great committee members. I had a really supportive cohort and a supportive. Both of my co-chairs. They were both extremely supportive. They were such cheerleaders that I was suspicious that they were not telling me the whole truth about my work, and I didn't feel my work deserved such support from such eminent people. But they were very supportive, and I loved that, and they were encouraging for me to go on the market, and so, and I wanted to give it a shot, but my eyes were wide open the whole time. And, about my third or fourth year in graduate school, I'd also taken a part-time job teaching test prep at a company that a friend of mine had worked at, and said, it's great, it's good money, they're really respectful of teachers of our caliber, and they love the fact that we're getting advanced degrees, it looks good for them, they'll pay you pretty well. And so I did. I taught part-time at this company while I was finishing my dissertation and being on the job market. And I'd never really considered working for that particular company because it wasn't the sort of philosophical environment that I wanted to be in. It really was a more typical test prep kind of place, which is not what I was interested in and still not what I'm interested in, which might sound ironic to you. But when I was in the market, I had interviews, and they were terrible, and it's probably because I wasn't that interested in the jobs I was applying for, and I don't think I worked as hard as a lot of other people probably worked to get those jobs, and I sort of set myself up to take another path, and I didn't know what the other path would be. I didn't want to work at this company I was working at. I mean, I figured I could probably continue drawing a paycheck while I figured it out. But after my first year on the market, I decided to look at private high school teaching as another alternative, because again, I wanted to really just be a teacher more than anything. And I had an interview and it went really well, but the dissertation chair convinced me to give it one more shot on the market, so I declined the job and went one more year on the market, and it was even worse than the first. Even though I had PhD in hand, I was a lecturer at UCLA, a full-time lecturer, so I had more credibility than I even had my first year on the market, but I had 0 interviews. I had nothing. And I was like, all right, that's enough for me. It's probably enough for the rest of my committee. So at that point, I was reaching out to people that I knew, and one of them was someone who had just recently opened the company I now work for. And I called him because he had worked for the company that I was working for, the test prep company. And he had left sort of suddenly and opened this new company, and it was a big scandal at the office, and everybody's like, did you hear? He opened this other company, and it's scandalous. And I was like, that's interesting. The person I probably respect the most out of everybody I work with left the company to open his own. Let me find out what's going on with that. So I called him, and it was really just to find out. And I was like, so tell me about Summa. And he's like, well, and he basically told me what I told you in so many words and many, many other words. And we had many conversations, and I had just gotten married and was living with my wife in LA, and there's a whole backstory there. We had long distance relationships, and finally we're together in the same place and living in the same house, and we were finally married, and we were really, really happy. And 3 months later, I moved to San Diego to take a job at Summa, and she's in grad school. She's now currently finishing grad school in LA, and we've been married but living apart for basically the last 3 years. While I came to Summa to basically help it grow as a company and to try to put down roots, and it was always exploratory for me. It was still a test prep company. I'm still skeptical, like probably everybody here, of working in that environment. But it turns out that the company is truly not interested in just gouging panicky parents and students about test prep, but rather using the opportunity of that population of students to educate them in many other ways. And the founder of the company has since left the company for various reasons I won't get into. If you're curious, I can tell you later. But and now I've sort of moved into more of an executive role, which has given me a lot more room to help the company grow in the ways that I think are important, one of which is outreach. And I've been doing a lot of taking the money from the affluent parents who are paying us full tuition and using it to subsidize free test prep for a lot of underserved schools and other underserved students in the community. Not as many as I'd like, but we're still small, and I'm hoping that can continue to grow. So it's been really, truly like a wonderful experience for me. But the sequel to the story is that since my wife is finishing grad school in LA, and I took the job down here because I was going to help it grow into LA. The idea was never for us to set up shop down here. I actually am planning to move back to LA and was back on the job market looking for opportunities. I had 2 options. One was to pursue what I'm doing now independently, which actually is a career that I didn't know about until I started doing this. It's called independent educational consulting. Has anybody ever heard of that? It's actually a pretty cool field. I mean, if you like to work with teenagers and you don't mind pushy parents, and you feel like you can manage their expectations pretty well, as long as you know something about the world of college admissions, and it helps if you have a background in teaching, because you can give them multiple perspectives on that whole path and the whole process. It's actually a really rewarding job, and it's basically what I do on a daily basis at Summa, except not necessarily with the test prep. It's really focusing mainly on college planning, on helping parents and students navigate. My students don't know the difference between a university and a college. That's like the first thing I teach them. And from there, I try to encourage them to think much more broadly about their options, and then I talk to them about financial aid, and I talk to them about summer enrichment activities and things like that. And it's basically all of those things and anything else you can think of that has to do with preparing for college. And I'm essentially a mentor for them. So one option was set up shop on my own, doing that in Los Angeles, but I also circled back and looked back at the private high school kind of world. And when I went to the job page for independent schools. It's NAIS, in case you're wondering, National Association of Independent Schools. They have a jobs board open to anyone to look at, and they post, jobs. Duh. So I typed in English and Los Angeles, and one school popped up where I've actually had a friend, also a UCLA graduate student friend, who got a job there after he got his PhD. Also someone I worked with at the test prep company in LA, who left the company to get a job at this school. It's called Marlboro School in Los Angeles. And they were hiring for the exact job that I have been wanting for basically 4 years. So first thing I do, put my application together, called up my friend and said, hey, I just want to bring your attention to my application that I just sent in. And literally it took 4 weeks and I got the job. So this is totally brand new. I'm like still stunned and shocked. But in the fall, I'll be an English teacher at Marlboro School in Los Angeles, teaching high school students British and American literature, which is what I do in a way. And it was, again, serendipity, and it was knowing people, and it was not being afraid to reach out, and it was being open-minded, and it was not closing off options, as Natalie put it. It's having all your doors open. And that's advice I give to my students, and it's advice I hold dear to myself. And I'm really sorry to be leaving SUMA because it's an opportunity that I've never thought I would have. And I've realized that I have a set of talents and skills that I never would have known about. And I wouldn't have gotten the job at Marlboro if I didn't have this experience, because I've worked very, very closely with teenagers and their parents in a private school setting, which when I was interviewing, this came up a lot. Like, you don't have high school teaching experience, so why would you be a good fit for us? And I'm like, let me tell you, and just went through the list of things that I've learned from working with the young people that I work with, and from having a bigger picture perspective on the student as a whole, as opposed to just, I want to convince them to love Henry James. That is not my job, but if I had come straight from grad school and went into the private high school teaching thing, that was the first time I interviewed for the schools. That was really the limit of my ability to conceptualize what it would mean to teach teenagers. I want them to love literature, but that's not actually what matters, I think, at these schools. It's understanding how that subject, the value system that you take as a teacher kind of fits into this much, much bigger picture of not only all the other subjects they're learning, but their goals, their dreams, their plans, their misconceptions about what those things are and should be, and how important it is to be there as a supportive guide along the way. So I feel like the transition I'm about to make to high school teaching is it's not a detour. I feel like it's the culmination, really, of like the seeming detours that I've been taking. And it's just weird how these things can kind of come together unexpectedly. So there's hope. I remember one thing that the director of the sort of job market, sort of lead director when I was first on the market, which he said at UCLA, which was, if you want to teach in California, you have to leave California first. And then or if you want to teach at the UC, you have to leave the UC first and come back. And I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to prove you wrong. Well, okay, I'm not teaching at the UC, but I didn't have to go very far away to come back and actually land the job that I'm going to be much happier in than I probably would be in any other job. So I think that answers your question.
Yeah, so I want to open it up now. And